So without further ado, I request Professor Sushmita Das to begin her talk.
Thank you, Shubhadi, for the nice introduction. And I sincerely thank the organizer of this conference, especially Professor Sen, for giving me this opportunity to come and speak on this podium. The title of my talk is Evaporation of Saline Droplets, and I'll show you the many beautiful images in this talk. What is saline drop? Saline drop basically means a salt solution, all right? And why are we bothered about salt solution? So the presence of salt is almost universal in the tap water that you have, or let's say in heat exchangers which have often dissolved salts, calcium carbonate, calcium sulfate and so on. Basically when you have these salts present, the deposition or the inorganic scaling because of the salt can cause severe issues. For example, in this image you can see scale buildup. Scale, by meaning of scale I mean inorganic fouling, and when the scale builds up you have reduction in the area, cross sectional area, and it can lead to severe pressure drops. It also leads to reduction in the thermal efficiency because these salts are actually insulating. So if you have boiling phenomena or simple heat transfer, you can immediately calculate that you will have a significant temperature drop across these salt buildup layers, which is not good. So to give a percentage, 2% of the total world energy production per year is actually spent in because of the scale related issue. So there is inorganic fouling, there is organic fouling and so on, right. The scale also, or the salt, is also a major issue in desalination plants. So here you see some capillary tubes in membrane distillation where you have the issue of inorganic fouling. In my lab we have shown that when you have thermal desalination by solar thermal desalination, which is aided by capillary effect, again the buildup of salt is the limiting factor, right. Even in buildings, because of the wicking of liquid from the ground into the buildings, you can have pressure buildup and it can lead to crack propagation. So again, why saline drops? So you see that in all these cases the interface plays a very important role. So salt will accumulate or crystallize whenever you have an interface because that has a lower energy barrier for crystallization, right. And why droplet is because droplet is a very simple system where we have interfaces. Imagine a droplet on a flat surface, you have a triple contact line. So it's easy to understand that what is the effect of wettability, what is the effect of crystal morphology on the effective salt formation. And that is what we have used as a platform to understand how crystallization happens and what is the role of surface wettability. This is like some previous work where you can see that when you have evaporation on a hydrophilic surface, the crystals are more oriented along the triple contact line, and it's very difficult. This is calcium sulfate crystals, and it's very difficult to remove such crystals. So I'll just give a very brief background. Professor Sunanda Das Gupta already gave a discussion about the evaporation and deposition. So when a droplet is evaporating on a surface, you can imagine that every surface has a contact angle hysteresis, right. So initially when the droplet evaporates, the evaporation happens in a constant contact radius mode. That is, the radius remains pinned and the evaporation occurs, you have a volume loss and so on. Once the contact angle reaches the receding contact angle, then the constant contact angle mode of evaporation initiates, where the contact angle remains fixed and the droplet contact line recedes, and followed by a mixed mode. So the way, if you have, that's a droplet evaporation. Once you have particles present, colloidal particles, the evaporation is dependent and the evaporative deposition is dependent upon several factors such as the wettability of the surface, that is the initial contact angle, the contact angle hysteresis. For example, what is the difference between the advancing and the receding contact angle? What is the shape of the particles, size of the particles? We saw different type of depositions in previous talks, like when the particle size is nanometer, you get a different patterns compared to micron size and so on. And what is the shape also? Salt solution you can think of as a colloidal system but different, because salt solution starts as a solution where we don't have any crystals, and as the droplet evaporates, the droplet becomes more and more saturated, and beyond a critical supersaturation you start seeing crystals, right. And the way And now the crystal patterns and how these crystals are going to grow will depend upon what is the shape of the crystal and how is it oriented near the contact line. We can immediately say that if I have a drop, the nucleation is more preferable at the triple contact line because that is more preferable because of the Gibbs free energy. So here are some examples of literature, work from the literature. You can see that this is a calcium sulfate crystallization pattern on surfaces of different contact angle, 8 degrees, 26 degrees, 104 degrees and so on. And you can see that the pattern can be very different. In calcium sulfate it has a low solubility, you see a ring shaped deposit. In sodium chloride it's a cubic crystal, and you can see that as you increase the contact angle it tends towards a single crystal, right. In my previous work we have shown that this is for calcium sulfate depending upon whether the surface is hydrophilic or hydrophobic. You can range from a ring shaped deposit. You can see that these are dendritic crystals which are oriented along the contact line. So you can immediately say it's very hard to remove such crystals, to more localized form when the surface is hydrophobic, right. So in literature we have also looked at the very beautiful patterns of the spiral rings or these dendritic features, for different morphology of salt. In Varanasi group, recent work, they have shown that when you have a specific non-communicating structure, basically you have these cavities, but these cavities are not talking to each other, they are separated. They observe this crystal, what they call as a crystal critters, where there was out of plane formation of the crystal legs. So my talk today is going to deal with two main topics. One is what is the effect of salt morphology. Let's say I go beyond calcium sulfate or sodium chloride, which is cubic structure. What happens to the way the crystallization happens, and then what is the role of surface wettability. I'll immediately start. So most of the studies in literature are based on sodium chloride, which is a cubic crystal. But what happens in the needle shaped crystal? For example, the case of potassium nitrate. Right? Potassium nitrate is very commonly used in fertilizers, paintings, art writings and so on, in thermal storage devices and so on. So this is an example where there is disintegration of a painting because of the wicking of the salts that is there and crystallization of potassium nitrate, and we did some studies where we just put a drop of the salt on a paper, and you can see that the footprint is much larger. So this is a video where it's a top view image of a droplet of potassium nitrate on a superhydrophilic surface. So it's a silicon surface which is plasma clean, so the contact angle is closer to 0. So you can see that immediately the crystallization starts, and these are all, one second, it's moving. You can see that the crystallization starts, and as the crystals form, it self amplifies. Basically the crystals are needle shaped. So the space between the crystals now act as wick, so they have a high permeability. So the liquid wicks through the crystals to increase the footprint area of the total deposition. So you can immediately see that why wicking and why the creeping is an issue for disintegration of paintings or porous structures. Right? So in this case the maximum evaporation happens near the contact line. So crystallization starts near the contact line, and the maximum evaporation is happening near the contact line. So replenish that liquid, again you have fresh liquid which is going and feeding the contact line, plus the crystals are acting as capillary structure, right. So if you zoom into this crystal structure, you will see that they have two different type of morphologies. One is this primary crystal which is on the order of like tens of micrometer, and second near this, so if you zoom into this part, near this there is this globular salt deposit which is less than 5 micrometers, right. So what we see was that when you have evaporation, this is like what we did here is a thin film of liquid, thin film of saline liquid, and evaporation is happening. So what we observe is that initially the nucleation occurs to increase the length of the crystal. So the crystal itself grows to form acicular crystal or a needle shaped crystal, and once this liquid has all gone into forming this long crystal, the liquid preferentially wets the crystal itself because of the high affinity of the liquid to the crystal. And now we have the liquid, but that is not enough to lead to the bulk crystallization of the needle shape. What it does is that it forms these small globular crystals near the long crystal primary network. And if you track the diameter of this crystal front while it is growing, you see that it linearly grows, the average of that linearly grows, and the spreading diameter is 90 microns per second for a given temperature again. Things change when you change the contact angle little bit. So here the contact angle is 55 degrees, and you see this is again a top view. You see that crystals again occur at the triple contact line, which is not surprising to us, but you see that the behavior of the crystal front is very different, right. You see what happens here, if I play it again, is that the crystals again form at the triple contact line, and the contact angle is important because that determines the orientation of the crystal at the contact line. So, if the contact angle is 50 degrees, the crystals will be oriented at 50 degrees, and as it is evaporating, the meniscus that is there, that remains uncovered at the top, but at the side it is all covered, right. And then evaporation is mostly happening from the top. I will show a schematic for that. So, we have the crystals which are first oriented, which are first nucleated near the contact line, and the evaporation happens near the top, and then as this meniscus evaporates, it recedes into the primary crystals, and at the end what we have is that the liquid is here, and beyond a critical angle the liquid again seeps outward, and what we see is a globular crystal deposit, which is different than what we saw earlier. Earlier in the case of a superhydrophilic surface, we saw more of a needle shaped deposit. Here it is mostly globular crystal, and that explains why the spreading front is very low. Because now what we are integrating is, initially we had the long crystals and the capillary wicking was happening through the crystals, which led to a higher spread. Here the liquid front has to move through these tiny globular crystals that are formed, which is the order of like 1 to 5 micrometers, and therefore the permeability of such structure is less, and that leads to a spreading rate of approximately 8 micron per second. Again, do not go by the absolute numbers, this is for a given temperature, and we have done systematic studies over a range of temperature, but this is to give you an idea that how the permeability and how the morphology of the crystals play a role on the structure, on the net deposition structure. Things become even more interesting when we increase the contact angle little bit higher. So, when we change it to here, it is 72 degrees, and you will see what happens. So, this is zooming out. So, you see that crystals form at the contact line, but because the shape of the droplet, the contact angle is higher, it is immediately enough to engulf the entire droplet. So, now I have liquid inside and there is a crystal shell outside. So, it is difficult for the liquid which is inside to evaporate. So, therefore, what we see, and the other video is also the same thing, is difficult for the liquid to evaporate. So, now what we see is a combination of the previous two videos that I showed. So, you can see I will play this video again. So, what is happening is that this the crystal is covering the entire surface of the drop, and then as it is evaporating, the contact angle keeps on reducing, and you start seeing the outside globular crystal, and once the contact angle becomes lower than a critical angle, which we call as the wicking angle, then wherever these primary crystals were initially formed, there is preferential imbibition of liquid forming this petal shaped deposition. So, I will give a schematic for that. So, you can see this is what I was saying. So, you have a drop, the crystals form, they cover the entire surface of the drop, and then we have this beyond a certain contact angle, not contact angle, but beyond a certain angle, this liquid wicks outside, and you have these globular crystals, and wherever the primary crystals were formed initially, there is preferential growth, preferential wicking of liquid, which gives this beautiful flower shaped deposition. And if I track the diameter of this crystallization front, and I compare it with the initial diameter, you can immediately see the signature of the previous two regimes, one where the surface was superhydrophilic and second when the surface was hydrophilic. You can say that initially the regime follows, when you have these globular crystals, the regime follows that of the porous flow that we saw in the case of the second case, right. The imbibition rate was slow because of the formation of the small globular crystals, and when the contact angle becomes smaller, and when this liquid has a pathway, the liquid which was inside has now a pathway to wick out, and then you have this bulk flow of liquid which was initially trapped in the shell, and that flows outward, and you can see that the flow velocity is on the order of what we saw in the case of a superhydrophilic surface, right. So, this is a combination of the two. So, we see that when you increase the volume, we see this picture is not that clear, but when you increase the volume of the droplet, initial volume of the droplet, interestingly what we see is that the number of petals that form, that increase as we increase the volume, but it increases in a very consistent manner, and it increases in a way that the spacing between two consecutive petals remains identical. In this case it was an order of like 0.5 mm. So, what we hypothesize is that and interestingly if you look at, this is just a match between if you have the evaporation on a superhydrophilic surface and this 72-degree contact angle, you can see that the tendency is similar. So, you have this primary crystal network, and in the way these primary crystals are arranged, because I am saying that primary crystals are what is leading to this preferential growth of the petals, the way these primary crystals are arranged is in a uniform manner, and we hypothesize is that that is because it is similar to boiling. Let us say I have one nucleation, the region around the nucleation points get depleted of ions. So, you cannot have a continuous crystals which is forming all around, there has to be a critical spacing between crystals along the contact line, and that is our hypothesis. So, when we use the hydrophobic surface, you see that crystals form along the contact line again. So, therefore, the triple contact line is the driving mechanism, and you see that the droplet actually detaches, or the salt actually detaches from the surface, and this is what we wanted to investigate in further detail. So, take home message from here is that it is the same salt, same temperature, actually the same surface also. In this case we use silicon with different treatments, different surface treatment to get different contact angles, but you can immediately see the nature of deposition is extremely sensitive to the way we have to the surface wettability. So, second part of the talk is about what I spoke in the last slide. When you have a hydrophobic surface, the crystal lifts up from the surface, and we wanted to know why. So, there are several studies in the literature of this droplet evaporating on a heated surface. For example, here they looked at salt evaporating on a nanograss hydrophobic surface. This is group of Daniel Born, where they looked at self-lifting of sodium chloride on OTS surface, and this is what I spoke in the motivation slide. This is self-lifting on this nanotextured surface. But in all these studies, in this case there was no self-lifting. In this study they observed self-lifting on specific coatings and not on others, not on PDMS, and in this third work they reported the self-lifting only when they had a non-communicating nanopellet surface, nanograss surface, not even on micropellet surface. So, we conducted, so to look at this bias in the literature, disparity in the literature, we thought let us do some systematic experiments to look at the crystallization of different type of salts on different type of surface coatings and see what happens. So, we did some side view imaging and also bottom view imaging, so that we can look at the de-wetting front of the liquid, and we used a series of salt with different crystal habits, cubic, dendritic, needle-like, different coatings with different surface energy basically, and we varied the temperature and the initial volume. So, this is a side view image, a side view video of a droplet of potassium chloride evaporating on a PDM substrate which is melted at 70 degrees Celsius. So, you can see, I will play the video again. Yeah. So, you can see that initially you have these crystals that form. This is the bottom view image. You can see this liquid front de-wetting at the base, and I will tell you the reason why. De-wetting from the surface, and then this crystal basically lifts up on its own from the surface. It starts developing this crystal legs and it stands on its own. Benefit of this is you can just blow it out, you can just blow on it and it will just go off. So, basically you design surface which is scale resistant, right. So this is the bottom view image. So these points that you see here, those are the crystal legs. So those are in focus. So those are the crystal legs on which the crystal is standing, the crystal deposit is standing. To our surprise, we saw that this sort of crystal lift-off behavior is not restricted to a given salt, at least to the range of salt that we determine: potassium chloride, sodium chloride, potassium nitrate, ammonium chloride, everything showed the same behavior. We saw crystal lift-off on all sorts of salt that we investigated. Only the nature of the length of the salt legs and all that was different, but it was a universal phenomena that we observed. So what is the mechanism? If I take some snapshot of the video that I played in the beginning, so you see that this is a drop which is sitting, it's a potassium chloride solution which is sitting on a surface. This is the bottom view. Initially you start seeing these bigger crystals, and then these crystals form, like you form this primary cluster, nucleation of primary crystal, and then there is a primary crystal deposit that forms. Now the affinity of this salt solution to the crystals that have formed is much higher than the affinity of the salt to the surface. So if I have evaporation, this is a hot surface, so the evaporation is happening near the contact line and all around. It's better that the liquid detaches from the surface and stays attached to the salt crystals, and that is exactly what is happening. You see as the evaporation continues, the liquid deviates from the base, and that is what you see, a shell over here, a door type of opening over here, and the liquid preferentially goes and wets the crystal. And now what happens is that you can imagine, I have a big crystal which is sitting on the surface. There is definitely going to be a thin film that exists between the bigger crystal and the surface. And now when I am evaporating that thin film, it cannot form a big crystal, it has to form a smaller crystal network because of the space constraint, because of the thin film that is there. And that is what we are observing over here, and this is schematic that you can see here. So then the evaporation of that thin film is causing small crystals to form, and as I evaporate more and more, now the liquid that was initially in this liquid shell, because it does not like the surface, it likes the crystals more, that liquid now goes to the porous network and it evaporates from there. So you can think of it like a sink term there, and then you have continuous feeding from the top to grow the crystal legs, and that is what we see here, and you see the formation of the crystal legs. So if you take an SEM, we can see that the primary crystals are on the order of 100 micrometers, and the secondary crystals that are formed and the legs that are formed are on the order of 10 micrometers. So then we looked at the effect of surface chemistry. I showed you the effect of surface morphology, the salt morphology, that it was forming irrespective of the salt that we looked at. Surface chemistry, we did different type of coatings. So what changes is a time instant or the supersaturation at which crystallization initiates. But beyond that, the leg formation was observed in all the salt that we investigated. Then what we did was that we thought, let's increase the surface wettability further by having this pillared surface, textured surface, to see what is the effect on this growth, because there was like discrepancy in the literature. What we saw was that if you have a dense pillared surface, right, the contact angle is still higher, but a dense pillared surface. In that case, what happens? So this is the pillar morphology. This is silicon micropillars. You can see that in this case, we do not see the crystal lift off, but when the pillars are sparse, again the crystal lift off initiates. And that we can explain easily by saying that wherever I have a post, imagine I have a post, we have nucleation occurring even around the post, and if I have a salt which has penetrated, let us say 10% of the pillar, that means there is strong pinning force. So when we are doing these experiments over these microtextured pillars, actually the pinning force increases thereby, and therefore we do not see a crystal lift off. On the other hand, when the pillar gap is more, it behaving almost like a smooth surface because the roughness is very small. And we did a regime map showing that what is the influence of initial volume, what is the influence of the initial supersaturation, and we see that the crystal lift off is observed in all cases. Well, beyond a certain supersaturation we do not see. which is a much smaller value. We do see crystal legs even for a much smaller supersaturation, small initial volumes and so on. So, if we just look at, this is a very simple analysis that we did to look at, can we predict the rate of growth of each of these crystal legs. So, this is the rate at which the crystal leg height is increasing for different surface temperature, and obviously as we increase the surface temperature, the rate at which the crystal legs height increase, that increases. So, you can think of it like this. This is the primary crystals that I was talking about, the bulk crystals that form, and then we have a thin liquid film below it which is forming this small crystal, smaller crystals, and that is like a porous network. So, here if you look at this, finally the evaporation is happening at the surface. So, this is the heated surface, and then I have this small crystal network, right. So, the rate of evaporation that I can determine using the diffusion law, I can determine the rate of evaporation, that is being fed by the liquid wicking through the porous structure into the secondary crystal network or the small crystal network, and if you do that mass balance, we can determine that what is the rate of change of this height of the individual crystal, assuming a certain value of porosity, right. So, from that we determine the rate of height increase of the individual legs, but again I should point out that this is a very stochastic process because it is relying on nucleation of crystals which cannot be controlled. So, you cannot say that okay, this is a number of crystals that will form and so on, but what we can do is that if we know the surface temperature, if I know the diameter of an individual leg, I can determine how much, by what rate will it increase, right. So, the conclusion is that the necessary condition for this crystal liftoff is the preferential wetting of the liquid with respect to the salt compared to that of the surface. That is the necessary condition, and we have seen that it can be generalized for different salt irrespective of the initial volume and concentrations. So, I would like to acknowledge my postdoc Dr. Virkeshwar Kumar, who is now a faculty in IIT Kanpur, and my doctoral student Pranjal Agarwal, who is in the audience for this work, and I also acknowledge the Infosys Foundation fellowship for this work. I just want to note that Pranjal has a talk on Leidenfrost phenomena of binary mixture in some time at 4 o'clock session, which is now 5 o'clock session. And with that, I would like to thank you all. I am open for questions.
So, thank you Professor Das for an interesting talk. So, it is indeed exciting to see how contact angle plays an deciding role in crystallization of sessile droplets. So, now the floor is open to questions.
You did not comment, I think, how all these things, in particular the presence of salt, just that, affects the time of evaporation itself.
Ah, okay.
So, because it's not obvious, it could be quicker, but and also a side question, which is surface tension of water is a function of concentration of salt.
Correct.
And so we would be happy to know if this can play a role in the dynamics.
Correct. Yeah, thank you for the question. In terms of time of evaporation, here we were not focused on that because the time of evaporation is going to change. For example, people have worked a lot in the dilute solution regime where you don't see crystallization, right? But in this case, once you see crystallization, and I have to look back at the results, but I think there will be a reduction in the time because you are increasing the surface area significantly. But we have not looked at that aspect in this work. The second part is surface tension. Yes, the surface tension is going to change, but in the concentrated solution, the surface tension doesn't change too much with the salt. I think sodium chloride is around 72 to maybe 74, 76 it reaches. But here we are not looking at any internal convection inside the drop. For example, when the droplet is evaporating on a superhydrophilic surface, we don't expect any internal convection to be there. It just will be capillary flow. In the case of a hydrophobic surface, immediately the surface gets covered with a shell. So, it's impossible to see what is happening inside. Yeah, but it will be good to see. Yeah, I'm not sure how to do the visualization in that case.
I have a question here.
Yeah.
Well, here, I'm sorry.
Here, sorry.
Yeah, if you go to slide 21, I think my question would be most clear if you went there. Yeah.
Yeah.
So if you look at the top panel of images,
Yeah.
the effective center of mass of the salt contained in the drop is actually going up,
Yeah.
which means the water evaporating out of the drop is sort of doing work on the salt part of the drop, so to say, to increase, to raise the center of mass. Effectively meaning there's a transfer of energy from, so it's almost like a heat engine where the Gibbs free energy is being converted to effective work. What would be a mechanism for that? I mean, how is it actually, how is this transfer of energy happening?
More than transfer of energy, I would think of it like a building block. I'm like, so basically you have a thin film, you have a layer of crystals that are forming, and the liquid lifts up because the liquid is now detached from the surface. It's a hydrophobic surface, doesn't like it. It's already happy with the salt crystal, bulk salt crystals that are formed, and this network is there. So it's going up along with the liquid shell. So the liquid doesn't exist as liquid there. Liquid is like, it's like a wet crystal, we can imagine. And then so the liquid, you can imagine of it like a slushy liquid, you can think of it with like primary crystals with the liquid bridge maybe between them, and the liquid does not dissolve the crystal because it's a supersaturated liquid, right? And then you have this primary crystal. So I would think of it more in terms of the pulling power of this secondary crystal network that has formed, which is much small. The capillary force there is much larger. And plus it is like a sink term. So there you have evaporation. So liquid has to flow there in order to evaporate.
So I have a question that, you have talked about if there are constraints. For example, you have got other droplets where there is a chance of coalescence, or you have walls where, it cannot have unconstrained growth of crystals on the sides. What happens? I mean, have you started or are you trying to do?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I did not intend to do that, but we are doing some work on desalination, and my student observed that, so what he was doing was that he has evaporated surface where this salt film is wicking up. He saw that after a few days, he is seeing the same crystal like legs, and the liquid film has evaporated and has formed like small salt crystals, like deposit, but we have not looked into it. But I am surprised to see that even there we see these legs forming, and we have to look why.
So if I understood correctly in the model, you mentioned that the liquid is going through the porous crystal legs and then evaporating at the surface.
Yeah.
How much do you think would be the contribution of the evaporation through the legs itself?
Yeah.
Because there also there will be a lot of thin film through which significant evaporation could take place.
It is evaporating through the legs. But if you look at, let's say even this picture, you see this is the hot surface, and this crystal network is actually insulating, right? So that immediately the temperature gradient along the legs will be significant. So mostly the evaporation is happening at a thin region just near the contact.
Okay, thank you.
So I'm also speaking about the legs, and if I understand it correctly, this is also, those are points of nucleation.
Yeah.
And so you need a nucleation model, which has to be statistical in nature.
Right.
And we did the same thing for the crystal, iocine of supercooled liquid droplets.
Okay.
And our nucleation model basically said it's heterogeneous nucleation, and so it's probably proportional to the wetted area. So the question to check that would be, and that's my question, are the number of legs proportional to the volume of the droplet, actually to the spreaded area of the droplet?
We have to look into that. I'm not sure.
That would be
Here it is difficult to actually model the number of legs. My student Pranjal did this work, and she had spent a lot of time looking at the exact number of legs, because that will depend upon how the legs are also growing. Because if one,
it depends on the nucleation rates.
Number of nucleation sites also. Sites and how they are oriented as, so let's say the wicking rate at one place is higher than the wicking at other. So this gets quickly detached from the surface, and then it becomes.
But that's the statistical model.
Yeah,
it's the solidification delay.
Yes,
it's
yes.
the
We have not
freezing
looked into
delay.
that. Yeah, correct. So there are a lot of unknown things here still.
Yeah, so I'm sorry, I have another one. So about the top row.
Yeah.
So the question is, does it go up or does it go out of the solid? So if you flip upside down, what's happening?
So does it go up?
So if you flip the whole thing upside down and
it'll be a shell. It'll be like a shell with the legs. So it does move up. So what is happening is that, let's say you have this is, let's say, my solid blob with the liquid which is there, and then I have a thin layer of liquid here, and that evaporates to form the small crystals. Then this thing goes up because now it's standing on a pedestal.
No, this I understood. My question is, if you flip the whole thing upside down, does it go that way?
Oh, if I flip
your elephant now is
if I flip it,
hanging drop.
Oh, you're saying that if I flip it and do the same work.
Yeah, I'm asking what's happening.
I don't know.
Okay.
But that's a very good point we can see. So Pranjal has more work to do.
Hello ma'am, you have taken KCl solution and shown the different contact angle, showing different different shape at TCl. If I increase the solution concentration for same substrate, the contact angle will change. Then what will will be effect of shape?
Okay, that was one of the questions, that how is the surface tension changing with the concentration? Yeah. It doesn't change a whole lot. We have done, so here the work that I showed was for concentrated, but we have done we have done a lot of work with range of concentration. The initial contact angle is not a very strong function of the concentration. The same thing, it's a very good point actually. So especially in the first part of the work that I showed, where this crystal, the primary crystals were forming and the liquid was wicking through it, when the concentration goes down more and more, the length of the crystal decreases, and then it doesn't feed continuously. So the creeping phenomena actually significantly reduces with the concentration of the salt. That I didn't show, but we have done that.
Ma'am, another question is, if I have two substrates, one is metallic, another is polymeric surface, having same contact angle but different material, is there will be effect on after evaporation, effect on shape?
Yeah, we have also done that. So here I showed for silicon because it's a very nice smooth surface, but we have also done work with changing the contact angle on a metallic surface. Overall physics stays the same. We see the same behavior.
So let's thank this speaker once again.
Thank you.
And we would like to offer a token of appreciation to Professor Das.